Hey friend, welcome to Women Created and Called Live. I'm sorry I'm going a little bit late here. Technical difficulties again. I think something might be going on. We're gonna have to investigate that. But please do pray for protection on our technology because we're up to some big things and there might be somebody who is not so keen on that. But as I said, welcome to Women Created and Called Live. Are you a woman who wants to conquer your fear of failure so that you can finally follow through with God's plan? If so, you are in the right spot. Are you ready to say enough is enough and finally shed the masks that are preventing you from sharing the real you with the world? And you want to have a little fun along the way. It is a journey. This is not something that happens overnight. And so here we are. That's why we're here on this podcast. So I'm so happy that you have joined me. And I am your guide along that journey, Beth McGrain-Tran. And this is episode 2 of Women Created and Called Live. And today we are talking about personal development. What is the point? So I just want to tell you a little bit of a story here. I would say up until maybe the last 15 years or so, I would hear the words personal development and it would make me think of a Saturday Night Live skit. It made me think of, I believe his name was Stuart Smalley. And this was a character in this skit who would stand in front of the mirror and he would say, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and gosh darn it, people like me. And so it was this ongoing funny joke on the skit. And this is what I would always think of when I heard the words personal development. And it all seemed like it was a joke. It seemed like it was self-centered. And it seemed fluffy, like a fluffy thing. Why would I even want to pay attention to it? It definitely didn't seem like something that that a person, a Christian who was wanting to grow closer to God would want to pay attention to personal development. Have you ever been to a bookstore? If you go to the personal development section, it is massive. It is so huge. And you're going to find all kinds of flavors there. You're going to find, everything from very new age things. You're going to find law of attraction things. You're going to find meditation things. You're going to find a lot of different flavors, as I said, of personal development. Very often, you might not find in that section, you might not find very much Christianity in that section. So this was another reason that in my head, I had thought, okay, that's something, I'm going to keep my distance. That is what I had thought in the past. So after all, I just needed to focus on Jesus, right? That is, I thought that's all I need to pay attention to. I'm going to focus on my prayer life and that's enough. That is so good, but there's more. There's more to it. So that idea of personal development became about as valuable to me as that funny skit. Not so valuable. But now I see that those thoughts had led me to a very wrong conclusion. And I have sometimes heard similar things from other Christians. And this is why I wanted to talk about this topic today. So let's do a little bit of a comparison. And and I guess I did bring it up a little bit when I talked about what you're going to find in a personal development section of a bookstore. But let's dive a little bit into, basically, it's the approach that is different, okay? So in a secular approach, you will find that the answers are, you're very much looking inside of yourself for the answers to all the questions, to wanting to create in the world what you desire and have the life that you want and to be happy. Happiness is coming from within, and that's it, pretty much. That is how I would sum it up. And that may be oversimplifying it, and I apologize if that is the case. This has been my experience and my perception of what I have experienced. So the difference is, when we're talking about personal development in a faith-based context, then we're looking at what exactly does that mean? So it reminds me of that self-knowledge is a good thing. We are called to have self-knowledge. And I apologize, I get these mixed up sometimes. I believe that's one of the gifts of the Holy Spirit, is self-knowledge. So clearly it can't be a terrible thing to actually have awareness of the way that we think, awareness of what our actions are, awareness of how our thoughts and our feelings and our actions have an impact on other people. All of that is really important. I mean, how can we be a good Christian and follow in Jesus' footsteps if we aren't aware of what we are doing and thinking and feeling, and whether that is actually spreading his love to others? So that's the key right there. It's like, what is the purpose? Like I said in the title of this episode, what is the point of personal development? And then especially in a Christian context. And I would say that personal development has a similar purpose as if you think of self-care. So this is another thing. Sometimes self-care gets a little bit of a bad rap too, doesn't it? Because sometimes that can be seen as selfish, and put that aside for a moment, because the truth is that if we don't care for ourselves first, how can we care for others? If we don't fill up our well or our tank, or however you want to say that, if we don't first fill up with good things that come from God, then how can we share that with others? So personal development is a similar thing. If I am not taking the time to not only be aware of my thoughts and my feelings and my actions, but also to make sure that I'm in, it goes hand in hand with self-care, really, because it's about making sure that I'm in a healthy state of mind and a healthy body, and that I am taking care of myself so that I can care for others, so that I can share God's love with others. And when I say filling, getting filled up myself, I'm talking about receiving God's grace, because God's grace is what makes it all possible. And I'm going to get to that in just a second too. That is actually another difference between a secular approach to personal development and a faith-based approach, because when we are talking about personal development in a Christian context, we know that it is not from our own merits. It's not from looking inside of ourselves that we find what we need to actually change, our minds and put them in right order toward God's will. In order for that to happen, it's all God's grace. We have to receive God's grace in order to make those changes. Every single thing that we do that is good is coming from Him acting first in us. In Him we live and move and have our being. I believe that's from the Gospel of Matthew. I apologize if I have that wrong. So that is the big difference between the two, between the secular approach and the faith-based approach. So I wanted to touch on that first. So I mentioned awareness. So I always love the image of, and I especially think of this during Lent because that's when it comes up the most for me. But awareness is so important. And it makes me think of when you're driving driving a car, and then the sun shines really brightly on your windshield. And my son is here to deliver my coffee. Thank you, sweetheart. I'll tell you about what happened in a little bit. But as I was saying, when the sun shines on the windshield, then all of a sudden, sometimes you're very blinded, especially if that windshield is dirty or, just has dirt on it, or if it has a whole lot of bugs. But here's the thing, you might not have been able to see all the dirt and the bugs until that sunlight shone on the windshield. So I always love that image because it reminds me that I need the sunlight, S-O-N, light, to shine on me and show me where my bugs and the dirt and all of the stuff is that I get to clean up. It's harder for me to see it without God's light shining on it. So that is the awareness piece. It helps make me aware so that I can do something about it. So again, during Lent, it's a perfect time to ask God to shine the sunlight so that you can get it cleaned up. It's perfect. But that awareness is only the beginning of personal development. And, if you think about it, you might know some people who are really great at, imagining a goal that they have, and then they can steadily take active steps toward that goal. Unfortunately, most of us are not so great at that. Just think about the statistics that we hear around New Year's time. Every year, we have a goal, we're thinking this is gonna be the best year ever, and I'm gonna get in shape, and I am going to do all kinds of things. I'm gonna write that book, I'm going to start that business, I'm going to start this ministry, I'm gonna start all these things. And then so often, at least by the end of the month, so many people have already let go of what those goals were. They didn't do what was necessary to actually take those steady, active steps toward the goal. So most of us need additional support if we're going to actually follow through with those goals. And encouragement. We need encouragement along the way, because the truth is, how many of you experience, sometimes there's so much junk that happens, in between here. And if you're listening to me on audio, I'm pointing to my temples. So between the ears, there's a whole lot of junk that comes into our thoughts that is not truth, and it is and it really does a number on our ability to follow through with things, because there's so much self beat up in our thoughts. And as soon as you don't follow through with something, then your brain is going to remember that and say, oh, you're not a person who follows through. Remember when you did that? You said you were going to do that over there, and then you didn't. So your brain is so ready to bring those things up from the past that it is so important to have support and encouragement that actually helps you see, oh, that's just your brain trying to talk you out of it, trying to keep you safe because, maybe that caused you some kind of pain in the past when you didn't follow through. So your brain's just trying to protect you, and it's okay, because you can choose to do it anyway. You can choose to follow through anyway. And that is how we retrain our brains and show evidence that, oh, I am a person who follows through. That's how that works. Anyway, that was a slight little tangent. But the truth is, it gets hard when we are working toward any goal. And so that support and encouragement is so needed along the way. And that is what it takes to help us continue to make progress towards those goals. Sometimes it's not even progress we're looking for. Sometimes we need a boost to get that first step. Take the first step. And then we need another boost to take the next step and the next one. So always seek support when you create a goal and you are committed to it. Make sure that you have support to help you toward that goal. Another thing that is part of personal development in a Christian context is that we are seeking to do God's will. So it's about, I've got my will and there's God's will, and it's about how can I conform my will to his will so that it's one and the same. And then when we seek God's will, then that becomes our vision for the future. And that becomes the vision, that goal of what we are working toward. So in order to really get very firm and committed to that goal, we also need to discern. It takes discernment to figure out, okay, is this God's will? And if it is now the time? Is he calling me to act on this now? Sometimes we're choosing between two things. Sometimes both things are good. And so it takes a small little process to actually discern where you will put your commitment at, during this season, where you will commit to action. And then, of course, action is the next step. Once you make the choice, once you have discerned and you make a choice, that is part of discernment. You must actually make the choice. Then the next step is to actually act on it and stay committed to it. Then another part of personal development in the Christian context is actually cooperating with God's grace and practicing virtue. Now, please notice, and most of you, I just have a sense that most of you know this, but just in case, please notice that I said practicing virtue. There isn't a one of us who gets all of the virtues perfect all the time. Doesn't happen until we get to heaven. When we are all set for heaven, our virtues will be perfected. And again, that all happens through God's grace. That is not on our own merit. However, God invites us and calls us to cooperate with his grace. And we are called to act. We also need to act. So what is the purpose of that? I sort of touched on it already. It's to help us get ready for heaven, right? So cooperating with God's grace and practicing virtue, it's for the purpose of reaching beatitude. And beatitude is, that vision that we will see when we enter heaven. Beatitude is God's perfect presence. And we will see that when our virtues are perfected. And again, we reach heaven. So another thing that is really important to remember in this piece is that God does not move. God is constant, but it's us that is always moving. We're always moving either toward him or away from him. We're either growing closer to him or we're growing further from him. And the truth is that beatitude that I was talking about, no one gets there by drifting. Like I said, we're always moving. So if we are drifting, if we are not actively pursuing God's will every day, then our trajectory, and I think I brought this up in last week's episode, our natural trajectory is to actually move away from him. That's what happens in the drift. Now, this is really interesting to use that language because that is actually a little bit of an image that is also found in secular personal development. There is a phrase called stand up in the drift. Stand in the drift. So if you think about a river that has a strong current, if you are drifting, you are just going with that flow. You're just going with the current. But it's not a very deep river. So once you realize that you are able to stand up, then you can stand up and that current will just go right around you. It has no effect on you because you are standing up strong in that drift, in the current. So imagine it like this. Imagine that river current is all of the stuff of everyday life. It's the busyness of what so many I know have used this phrase, the bewitching hour, dinner time. When you're trying to get dinner on the table and everybody's hungry and things get a little bit chaotic and somebody's just coming home from work and the homework is trying to get done and all of these things are happening all at once and there's a little bit of chaos. That is something, for the purposes of this image, you can imagine all of that happening around you is the current or the drift. Now imagine if you are able to be aware that that's happening and seek God's grace in that moment. And then God's grace gives you the strength to stand up in that river, stand up in the drift, and stand strong. Just think of how powerful that would be and how you would respond differently to the people around you if you are standing strong in the drift and not getting caught up in all of the chaos that's happening around you. It's extremely powerful. And actually, I was going to bring this up later, but actually, no, not later. It's the perfect time. So this reminds me of a client that I coached who we had a 2-day event, and she joined us after the event on the first day. And she, heard about, I coached her on looking for God's grace in those chaotic moments. Pretty much what the picture that I just painted for you there. The kids get home from school and things get a little crazy for a little bit. So I had coached her on that. And then the next day, after the event part, she had an opportunity for coaching again. And she came back the next day and said that when her children came home from school that day, she remembered to look for God's grace in the present moment. She just stopped it. She just paused for a moment, took a breath, and said, okay, where's the grace? God is giving me a gift in this moment. Where is it? I know it's here. And because she was aware of it and she paused and she looked for God's grace in the moment, she responded so very differently to her children when they came in the door and they had all these things going on. I think they might have been upset about something too, but she was able to calmly respond to her child instead of what she typically would have done in the past. And that would have been, getting caught up in the drift and actually responding with yelling or just feeling all of that stress in that moment. And then probably a little bit of yelling. I know I've been there for sure. My boys are bigger now, as you saw my son come in. And so there's a little bit less of that because it's just a different season, a different dynamic. But boy, do I remember the days when it was very drifty and it was hard to not get caught up in that and hard to actually respond instead of react. Maybe you've heard that distinction before. Reacting is just a gut reaction and you're acting based on feelings, just on your raw emotions. And if you're feeling stress in that moment, then you're going to react very likely with some yelling. Versus responding where you pause and you become aware of your thoughts and your feelings in that moment. And then you're able to actually choose to think and feel something else and then respond in a different way. The action becomes different. Anyway, that is one example of how this can look in everyday life. And I have one more example for you. I had another client who I coached it was a one session. And she actually let me know, so some of the things that was going on for her. She is a very busy mom of 3 boys, and she and her husband run multiple businesses and a nonprofit, and she's working on writing her first book. So she has many things. She's got the goals, and she has a vision for things that she would love to do. And absolutely, she feels that God is calling her to these things. And she was having trouble with all of the things on her plate, having trouble finding the time to actually sit down and work on that book and do the writing. So in this one session, we looked at her schedule. We looked at her thoughts that she was having around, everything that was happening in her world at the time. And she came back and said later that one session led to her most productive week in a very, very long time. She got writing done, and I believe she hasn't quite finished it yet, but I think she is better at finding space in her calendar. I supported her with, as I said, both mindset and also some strategy to help her create, I'm putting that in air quotes, help her create time in her calendar for the writing process. So that is just a couple of examples of what personal development from, through a Christian lens can do. It helps you actually see what you're dealing with. And I've talked about this before. It helps you actually see what God has already gifted you with. What kind of equipment are you working with here? What are the gifts that God has already given you? What are your natural temperaments? What are your spiritual gifts? What are your strengths? What are your feminine genius gifts? And all of these are in your toolbox, so to speak. You have this equipment already, and so many of us don't even realize the equipment that God has already given us when He created us. And that's where the second part of this equation comes in, God's grace. It's just like that sunlight shining on the windshield. It helps you become aware of what He's already given you, and also become aware of the grace that's available to you in every moment of every day. God doesn't just give you grace once when you're born and then never again. Like I said, in Him we live and move and we have our being. He is in us every day, every moment. And because of that, you put your original toolbox, your natural equipment, and your graceful equipment together, and you have everything that you need to do God's will in every moment of every day. And it starts with awareness and prayer. That's what it starts with. So I am here on this podcast, and I am here, eventually we're going to get everything distributed out to audio platforms so that you can hear what you are equipped with and hear about God's grace available to you. And those are the things that will help you conquer your fear of failure and finally follow through with God's plans for your life. And I am here to support you. I'm here to encourage you. And most of all, to give you hope. To show you what's possible. Because nothing is impossible for God. The sky is the limit. So I want you to think right now, if anything is possible, what's one area of your life that you would really like to have to be different? What's one area of your life that you would like to be different? And then not just Don't get stuck in, oh, I wish this was different, but actually start to envision, what does God want for me in that area of my life? And try to visualize that. Where do you see yourself? Who's with you? What are you doing? What are the kinds of activities that are a part of your everyday life? What are the kinds of things that you are experiencing on a regular basis? And then realize that it's possible. It really is. And that is where life coaching can be such a huge support for you. So if you would like to check out and see if life coaching would be a great fit for you to help support you as you envision what's possible and actually take action toward it, to help you seek and discern and act on God's will in your life. And it can be in all kinds of different areas of your life. If you'd like some support in doing that and want to check it out, go to the link that is in the description of this video, or reach out to me on Facebook is a great way to reach me. Just send me a private message. Either of those works great. And we'll get on the phone and chat, and we'll see how I can support you. Meanwhile, I hope that you will join me next week for Women Created and Called Live, and I will see you next Wednesday. Have a wonderful day, and God bless you and all those that you love. Bye.